Welcome to another episode of Mindful City, Tuning into Life, a podcast to discover and celebrate the many ways that our city is using mindfulness in our practical daily lives. Welcome to another episode of Mindful City, Tuning into Life. Today we have as our guest L'Aura Pravs from Ayamveda. And I met L'Aura as she was my Vedic astrologer. I was connected to you through Ashley, who is my fellow Ayurveda student for life person. Yes. It's a constant studying. We will never stop. And I was told a little bit about Vedic astrology, and I was so interested. And I had a reading from you, and I still go through what you provided me. I still look at it as a study of myself. And every time when I go back, I find so much more information there. And I thought to myself, how come I didn't know about this before? and as I talked to others, I also realized that it's just not as a common for people when I say Vedic astrology, what's that? So I said, we have to get L'Aura to come on the podcast and share a little bit about yourself and how you came to Vedic astrology and what it means for us here. So welcome, L'Aura.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. And I'm so glad that you still find so much value in continued learning with that chart that I gave you. And you're right, it is forever. It's a learning that just goes on. And the more you look at your chart, the more you see in it. So it definitely doesn't end just with the one consult.
Yeah, once I read it once completely. And then I read it several times. Mm-hmm. But so much has happened over the last few months that when I read it back, I'm like, I missed that. I didn't notice that before.
Yeah.
It's incredible, the depth of knowledge that's in there.
Right.
How did you even come to Vedic astrology? What drew you to that?
Yeah. So when I was a child, I was really into all things tarot and astrology and things like that. And so I was kind of like this magical little imaginatory kid, like so many of us are, especially those of us who are now in the healing arts. And then, as I got older, I became a total science skeptic. I was just like, all of that stuff I believed in, it doesn't mean anything, And so I completely did a 180 while I was in college. And then one day, just a little bit after college, my friend Jen up in Toronto, I was living up there at the time, she asked me to go with her. We were both single. She asked me to go with her to an Ayurvedic sex seminar for Valentine's Day because we didn't have dates. So we went to an Ayurvedic sex seminar and I was just completely blown away. I'd never heard of Ayurveda before. And then I ended up getting a consultation with the guy who had done the lecture, and he integrated astrology and Ayurveda and Vedic astrology at that. So that was my first exposure to it. And my jaw just like dropped, I was like, how does this person know these very, very minute things about me? This isn't general. Like I told myself in college that all the stuff I used to believe in must be, And so I just really saw the value in that. And I basically immediately set to studying both Ayurveda and Jyotish right after that. So I started taking classes with Dr. Lott. I started taking classes at the Vedic Art and Science Astrology Center. I started just diving into it, both, in my personal time, as well as taking classes, as many as I possibly could. So that's kind of the beginning of it.
When you say Jyotish, is that the word for Vedic astrology?
Yes. And sorry, I didn't even realize I used that word yet, but I guess it's so ingrained in me. But yeah, Jyotish is basically, it means the science of light. And so essentially, Ayurveda is the science of life, and Jyotish is kind of considered the eye of the Vedas. It's the part of the Vedas that observes us from above. There's no bias. It just watches. It watches things happen in our lives. And so Jyotish is the science of light, and it is another word, and it's exchangeable with Vedic astrology.
Okay. And what is different between Vedic astrology, Western astrology, and Chinese astrology?
Yeah, I'm not 100% familiar with Chinese. I mean, I know that they have a system themselves, so I can't totally speak to that. But in terms of Western, which is the one that's mostly used by most people, so it's interesting because Vedic astrology, one of the first references in the Vedas, which, nobody knows exactly how old they are, but 5,000, 10,000 years, some people say, the very first reference is astrological. So the system of Jyotish, Vedic astrology, is significantly older than any other astrology as far as I'm aware. And about 2,000 years ago, the rishis essentially met up with the Greeks. And the Greeks were like, wow, astrology is really cool. And so they basically were like, teach us what you know. And so they did. And so there are definitely cross parallels amongst them in the sense that the planets and the signs tend to mean, and the houses actually all tend to mean somewhat similar things, not always identical things, but they mean similar things. But the main difference between them is the mathematics. And so so 2,000 years ago, at that very moment when they were learning, when the Greeks were learning astrology from the what would nowadays be called, the Indian culture, they were essentially looking at the skies based on Aries, the first sign, being at the exact moment of the spring equinox. And so in the mathematics that the Western astrologers use, they keep it stagnant like that. They assume they always, I want to use my words carefully here because I don't want to, I don't want to speak ill of another system. It's just very different in the sense that in the Western system, everybody knows that every single sign, at least in terms of the sun sign, has a specific amount of time dedicated to it. And it starts on a certain date and it ends on a certain date. So it's very seasonal. It's very much based on the equinoxes and the solstices. But what happened is actually that they didn't take into a consideration that there's actually the Earth rotates on a tilted axis. And so Vedic astrology takes that into account. And what that means is that we're not going around the sun in the exact same pattern every single year. In fact, everything's shifting a little tiny bit every single year, which means that the zodiac signs actually mathematically do not stay. The planets, as they go through the zodiac signs, do not stay in the same locations year after year. Specifically the sun, all of them, but the sun is more of a yearly thing. So essentially it's a mathematics thing. It's a recognition that, you can go to a planetarium and literally see that right now the sun is in the sign of Pisces. And it will be for almost another month. You can literally see that if they put the sky above you in the planetarium as it sits right now, you can see that it's in the sign of Pisces. But the Western system will still say that on March 22nd or something, that it will be Aries. And so it's actually, it's more of, I like, it's not that I say that there's no credibility to the Western system, but it's not astrology. And I hope I'm not insulting any of your listeners by saying that. It's more like seasonology. I don't doubt that every season has its own personality characteristics and things, but when you actually look at the actual skies, like the planets are in the locations of the zodiacs as they are in the Vedic system.
Well, that's interesting because just this weekend I was trying my best to explain what Vedic reading I had from my astrology chart to someone, and they said, well, what's the difference? And of course I said, I'm going to be doing a podcast on that soon. So no problem. But they mentioned that there was some news out that they said, apparently my zodiac's changing even in my Western astrology because the way that planets are lined up. So apparently they're looking at it
Right.
thinking, wait, I'm not anymore Aries, so what's happening? So
Totally. And NASA actually came out a few years back. I remember seeing the article, and they were like, astrology, I mean, they didn't use these words, but they were basically like, astrology is bullshit. And if it
oh,
were true, you would need 13 signs. And that's probably what you're referring to, because
right,
they
yeah.
added a zodiac sign. But if you actually use the accurate mathematics, you don't need a 13th sign. You just have to recognize that things shift over time.
Mhm, mhm.
So, yeah.
So how does it define then someone's birth? So because that's one of the things I think I'm not, I'm really new to
Yeah.
astrology. So when because now the way that I know it, okay, somebody's born on this day, all right, they're Capricorn, that's it. And
Yeah.
how do you use the information to make that determination?
Well, I mean, for me, it's relatively easy for two reasons. I have both a telescope and also I have a really phenomenal in-depth system on my computer that actually does these insane calculations. If I showed you a picture, you'd get googly-eyed, basically. So from that standpoint, that's how I determine exactly what degree somebody was, where their sun and moon and everything were at in their chart. Um,
Okay,
but
so
in
you're
turn,
looking at where they were when they were born.
when they were born, exactly. Yeah. So each person had like the very moment that they were born, the planets and the stars all lined up above them identically to the energy that's within them. And so it's said that you couldn't have been born a moment too soon or a moment later because
Ah,
it could only have happened when you identically matched the universe.
wow,
Yeah.
that's profound.
Yeah. I love that. I love thinking of it like that because, sometimes too, I mean, when I do charts, when I do birth charts, like the one that I did for you, sometimes people laugh afterwards. They're like, wow, this isn't exactly like happy, happy completely. Like this is pretty, this goes deep and this kind of cuts me sometimes. And I'm like, yeah, like nobody's chart is perfect. In terms of like how we would like things to be easy, smooth sailing, always blissful. We are all here living out our karmas. And that's, you know, actually traditionally astrology was used to understand how each person was diseased. So essentially how it is that our egos got wrapped up into this worldly incarnation. And so you can see through the chart where someone has hangups, where someone has
Mhm.
issues, where someone isn't forgiving themselves or others, or why they have the problems that they do. And so, in that sense,
That gives me a whole different perspective
yeah,
on
yeah.
on
It's
astrology.
totally wild, right? Because it's not just going to say you're going to have kidney disease. I mean, you can technically dive into that angle, but it's also going to show you, okay, if you're, let's say, a worrywart, that is one of the reasons you're sick, or something, along those lines too. And so the whole concept is that we are all doshically imbalanced here on earth, which doshas, of course, are the word for imbalance in Ayurveda.
Mhm. So this is also kind of, at least what I've seen in my chart, also a guide as to what is your lessons and your gifts and how you can use them for
Very
growth,
much. Yeah.
in your life. And so here's a question that I know most people would ask. Do you have a choice though?
So it's interesting. The answer is both yes and no. And what I mean by that is that, so there are three there. You don't necessarily, how do I explain this best? So I like to look at the birth chart as your DNA, essentially. So I don't know if you're familiar with epigenetics, but the concept of like the modern science of epigenetics, like you have your DNA, but your environment and your attitude and everything influences what gets expressed.
Mm-hmm.
So in that sense, it's both nurture and nature, and therefore fate and free will. But the main place where we get a choice is how we choose to respond to our chart. It's not that we have a choice as to what we're born into or, how we are most inclined to act, But because the planets are still constantly moving, even after that photograph, that snapshot was made to create who you are, that very moment that you were born, you're like a walking photograph for that, of that particular place and time and space. And so you're walking around like that, but you're constantly being influenced by both things here on Earth as well as the transiting planets above. And so those are all going to be slowly reshaping your karma. Now, I'd be very careful to say that we have a choice in a major way. Honestly, like I think a lot of it is quite fated, but we do always have the choice whether we respond to a situation that we're confronted with, tamasically, rajasically, or sattvically, which I can explain as well if you want me to. But
I would, yes.
Okay. I know those are kind of, it's so funny because it's like Vedic astrology is such an intense science that it's like, bringing it down to the beginner's level can be quite tricky. But yeah, so let's say, let's take the planet Mars. Every single person has Mars in their chart. I like to use Mars because he's such a beautiful example of this, but we all have Mars in our chart somewhere. And for some of us, Mars might be in Capricorn where it's exalted. And if it's exalted, it means that Mars there has good grounding. Capricorn's a really heavy earth sign. So when Mars is there, Mars is the warrior planet. He doesn't often, rage for no reason because he's grounded in Capricorn. But let's say he's in Cancer for somebody else where he's debilitated. That means that he's going to be very emotional usually, and so someone who has an exalted Cap or exalted Mars might have an easier time dealing with their anger or a more stable type of anger in them, whereas someone who might have it in some other sign won't have that, come to them as easily. But we still have the option of responding, again, tamasically, rajasically, and sattvically. And tamasically, tamas is the lowest vibration. So let's say, like that would be like the violent thug in the, whatever area of the world. That would be, Mars acting like a violent person, physically violent. In the rajasic, which is the very active way of responding to life, he might be an avid debater, always wanting to be right, competitive. He might also be physical, but it will be coming from a more active, competitive place as opposed to low vibrational. It'll be very active. And then in a sattvic way, he might choose to protect society with his warrior-like ways, like a forest fighter, something like that. And so, each planet, each zodiac sign can be expressed in those three categories, like basically high vibration, middle vibration, or low vibration. And so that, I think we always have a choice. It is easier when our planet is placed in a position it already likes. So it will always be easier for someone whose karma is easily someone whose planets are placed in certain signs that make that planet happy. It'll be easier for them to behave in a more peaceful, loving way than someone whose planet is in a location it doesn't like.
That's really incredible to know for someone, because even in general, I think this is why people have a hard time with astrology. I was only introduced to Western astrology growing up, is that you find that even though I'm a Capricorn in Western astrology, I know other Capricorns and we're so not alike.
Right.
I'm like, which planet, So part of that is going back to what you said about the DNA, which I think is so beautifully stated, is that where the choice lies is in the vibration that we choose to express that.
Yes.
In a way, right? So you were saying nature nurture is that might be our blueprint, that might be our DNA, that picture that was taken at our time of birth, and then how we choose to express that DNA is going to depend on if we're using it with the lower vibration, the tamas, the
Mm-hmm.
rajas, or sattvic in the
Yeah,
highest vibration, because that is where people, because in that case you can say, I have an option in how I choose to express that. And
exactly.
yeah, and perhaps what is your take then on, because that is the reason why most people go on a journey of meditation, of yoga, any spiritual journey that they choose to take into their life.
Yeah.
It's almost because they want an option, right? Because they know
Yes.
what they have. Like, I want it to be different. So I think you're bringing up something really incredible here. So what is your understanding of yoga and meditation in understanding your chart and how you can use that moving forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I can definitely speak to my chart, but I can also, it might even be more helpful if I actually stay general with this.
Yes.
Mostly just because meditation in astrology, in Vedic astrology specifically, is always said to be done for the moon. And so the reason is because, in Western, there's so much emphasis placed on the sun. In Vedic, the moon actually takes more precedence than the sun sign. And the reason for that is that the moon is our emotional state. And so that's what actually often determines how we decide to respond.
Mm.
And so when you meditate, you're meditating for the moon. And the moon, if you just look up in the sky, it's a very obvious thing. It's fickle, it changes. It's not the same day after day. It's in a different shape, it's in a different size, it waxes, it wanes. And so, all of those qualities of the moon are also true of our emotional nature. And so when you meditate, you stabilize the mind. And the same thing could be said in the union of mind and breath, or breath and body, sorry, with yoga, with a hatha yoga practice. And so it's about, stabilizing that fickleness to be able to choose as sattvically as possible in as many moments as you can, despite how difficult your karma might be.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
And how does that then, because that is such a incredible part of the different ways in which we express our planetary influences, how do you look at relationships in Vedic astrology in terms of
Yeah.
I don't even have to say
Well,
anything else. I
there's
wonder how it works there.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a lot of ways to look at it. Some people specifically will focus on the moon signs because that is our emotional nature. And, you can definitely see in a chart whether two people will easily understand one another or not. And oftentimes it has to do with how far apart their moons are. So if your moon is in Scorpio and mine is in Taurus, those are completely directly opposite. That will be, more challenging than if they were closer together.
Mhm.
And so the moon, of course, goes through all the zodiacs roughly within 1 month's time. So we're all over the place. It doesn't have to do with the year you were born or the month that you were born. It's, wherever the moon was in relation to the very moment and day that you were born. And so, the moon sign can definitely be one indicator, but I still like to look at the two charts as a whole each, because each of the houses, and I know we haven't really discussed houses, but houses are basically the locations in the sky. We divvy up the sky above us to understand it as different areas of our lives. And this is something that the ancient Vedic rishis studied in great depth. And so these are pretty stable across the board with all astrologies, from what I understand, definitely Vedic and Western.
Mhm.
And essentially the houses all stand for different parts of our lives as well. And so, this is why sometimes when people have a best friend and then they're like, I love this person so much, they're my favorite person, or a romantic partner, same thing. But then in certain areas of your lives, you just don't get along, even though by and large you're the best of friends or you're the best of lovers or whatever, you know? And so looking at a chart and looking at what's going on in each person's house can also really make sense of why there are areas that are more struggling for those two people than other areas.
So when you were saying that the moon, because of the time changing in between, does that go for all planets? So, or do some move faster than the other?
Yeah, they all move at different speeds. They all move at different speeds. And so the moon is definitely the fastest. It's the closest to Earth. And so it goes through all 12 zodiac signs in 1 month, roughly. The sun, of course, has roughly one zodiac per month. And that's why, you know, the you know what I mean? Because we're going around the sun. And so the sun will basically have 1 month per zodiac sign. And that's why there's 12 of them. And actually, you know, not to go off on a tangent too much right now, but in Vedic astrology, we don't just look at the sun signs, which are considered, you know, all of the planets other than the moon move across the elliptical, which is why they're all going through all of the same 12 signs. But there are also nakshatras in the Vedic astrology system, which the Western doesn't acknowledge. And those are actually lunar mansions. So they're parts of those same zodiac signs, but they're based on the moon's orbit around us. And so those are considered the feminine part of our personality, whereas the 12 star signs that we're so familiar with are the masculine.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but to get back to the question, because I know I go on tangents and I'm sorry about that.
I love these tangents.
I know. I'm a Gemini moon, so I am all over the place with my emotional, mental psyche. But yeah, so going back to your question, they all move at very different speeds. And so Saturn is the slowest moving planet. And so, you know, it also, for that reason, stands for old age. It stands for things that are slow and take time. And so they're all the characteristics that you can see in the physical planets are actually also the psychological elements to them. So, you know, Mars is red, it's fiery. Mercury is fast. So it's the communication channel. It's the internet. It's, you know, it's all things fast. And Saturn also is boundaries. It has those big rings. You know, Jupiter is the biggest planet. It expands everything that it watches or observes or influences. So all of them have, you know, this quality to them that translates directly into how they affect us.
I could listen to you talk about the planets all day. And this is just mesmerizing to me. Because I do feel that there is places where we are alike, and then there's so much uniqueness to each person. And so to look at someone's charts in depth like you do, that's just that's incredible.
Yeah, and it's fascinating too, because it's like I always tell people, you know, one thing that I think sometimes I actually enjoy skeptics more than I even do the people who immediately are like, oh, I love astrology. And then they just start going off about, you know, their sign, because sometimes people get so hung up on their Western sun sign that they start to think that other personality types are not that great. And so they'll be like, I hate Geminis, or I hate Scorpios, or
I see
whatever, you know? And I'm like, first of all, you're probably not even the sun sign you think you are. But secondly, we're actually, all of us are all 12 signs. It's just that where in our lives are we each of those signs? So essentially, we're all just a broken mirror of each other. So we're all the same thing. There's only one consciousness, but we're all broken into our own version of how we're looking at the world. So all of those signs have to be present in all of us.
Beautifully said. I know, and I really do hope that we can have you back on the show and really go more into depth to talk about different planets and different ways that they affect us in our lives. And I'm also looking forward to your course that you're going to be putting out soon.
Yes.
Do you want to tell us about it?
Yeah, absolutely. So it started as a workshop idea because my favorite thing, I love doing charts. They're fun to do. But what I actually find I love the most is really empowering people to start diving into the rabbit hole of self-understanding and self-reflection on their own without the need of an authority. And in this case, an astrological authority like me. So my dream is actually to empower people, to give them both the basics as well as advanced as they want to go with me, eventually, to understand their own chart. So try to learn how to read it from knowing nothing all the way, even in this basic course that I want to start teaching, which is going to be both online version as well as I'm going to find a little home for it locally here as a workshop. A 3-part course teaching people about how to begin to really understand themselves through Vedic astrology.
Sign me up.
Awesome.
So thank you so much for sharing this beautiful knowledge with us and guiding us to understand our own DNA and how we can use it at the highest vibration. And so I thank you for that. And I hope to have you again soon on the show.
Thank you so much, Helen. I loved it.
Thank you, Laura. Namaste.
Namaste.
To find out more about Vedic astrology and Laura, find her on social media under Ayamveda, Ayamveda, Ayamveda.